When I think about being a generalist, when I was younger in my career, I was actively trying to avoid that. I see my colleagues putting posts on LinkedIn. I was like, I don't own one thing. I can't post about that. I don't know what to do.
I've always just felt Spotify is so different to me in the UAE than it is to me in the UK.
Localization is key, and thank you for saying that. I'll tell the editors because a lot of the localization that's done is on the content.
When you want to then go into new markets, like how do you make that decision?
Yeah, so I think it's a lot of things popping up and the world is really excited, but they are amazing opportunities. But is your product appropriate for that opportunity? Is the audience for your product big enough?
When do you cut your losses sometimes? When do you say this isn't working? I think that's a hard skill. It's a hard skill, right?
That's hard. That's also really hard because you're not waiting to the end of the year to figure out if your strategy worked. You know what I mean? You're monitoring it the entire time. There's no point spending and investing all of this time in generating demand if you have no tool to capture it.
You've mentioned fandom a few times. Yeah. What is fandom at Spotify?
So I think it's about...
Hi, I'm Sarah Qadan, and this is She Builds, where I interview growth, product, ops, and marketing leaders to understand how they've built high-performing teams, scaled businesses, and the frameworks that got them there. So today I'm joined by Ruthie Qadan, Head of Strategy and Operations at Spotify MENA South Asia. So for more than 15 years, she's used her experience and expertise to manage regional and international marketing strategies of leading real estate, retail and luxury brands. Before joining Spotify, she held various leadership positions at Altaya and Shalhoub Groups, which are some of the largest companies here in the UAE. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining me. So I think just looking at your experience here, one of the things I would love to dig into straight away is how you navigated from being a marketing professional for 10 to 15 years and now being in more of the kind of generalist space.
Yeah.
So I'd love to know what led to that transition, what a generalist means to you, and talk us through that.
Yeah, good. It's a good question. And it's funny because when I think about being a generalist, when I was younger in my career, I was actively trying to avoid that. Although I was always in marketing roles, but I always had kind of marketing operation roles. So I was kind of looking over it. And I always looked at media experts or social media experts or comms. And I was like, I need to specialize because I don't know enough about any one thing. I'm not an expert. And I was kind of actively trying to kind of get out, find a specialization, but it's not where my career took me and it's not the opportunities that were opened up to me. But when I reflect back, the fact that I was a generalist was exactly why I am where I am today, which I'm incredibly grateful for. I think I only realized kind of the power of being a generalist probably in the last 5 years. Prior to Spotify, I was also doing my own consulting business. And I think my ability to not only take on clients as a marketing leader, but also help advise them on, okay, what's the operational model that you need? How are you going to hire your team? Like how your operational process is set up in terms of customer service was also meant I could add a lot more value to my clients. And I ended up getting very kind of long-term clients out of that because I became more of an integral part of the business. And then I moved to Spotify. And when I was in Spotify, I joined in kind of a marketing role. But very soon after, there was this opportunity that was presented to me, which was the strategy and operations role. And I thought, no, I'm a marketer. Like, how can I do this? But I think the value that they saw was that you can work across the rest of the business. So I think the fact that while I resisted it at first, the fact that I've been able to be kind of on the top of a lot of the business and oversee a lot of different functions has also really, really helped me in my career. I guess kind of what a generalist means to me is that the first thing is that you're a problem solver because you get to kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture. You've seen things from a lot of different angles and you're not kind of stuck in a silo in terms of addressing different challenges that a business can come up. The second one is that you're really adaptable and kind of we don't work in easy environments. There's no set of rules that, okay, we follow this and we get to the next one. So I think that managing kind of complex situations that have a lot of moving parts is also kind of one of the big benefits of being a generalist. And then the thing that honestly for me that I love the most is the learning in being a generalist, because when you're a generalist, you're often, you know enough about maybe a portfolio of things, but because you're a generalist, you then put into another conversation. And that's maybe something you weren't exposed to before. Like I think my role in Spotify now, I'm in conversations with like the macroeconomic risk team, in the government affairs team. And these are things that have like never been in my orbit before, and I would have never actively gone and pursued them, but I actually find them, it's like, sound like a nerd, I love it. Like, you know what I mean? I find myself so satisfied in those conversations and the exposure to those people and like learning exactly how that works. So I think I love that there's just this exposure to things that I would have never put myself in that position for.
Amazing. Yeah, I think a lot of people resonate with the whole like feeling that you have to specialize, because I think there's like, and it's only as I've got older in my career, and I the same as you, right? I really do feel like there is such a power in being a strong generalist, and I think there's obviously a lot of negative connotations with generalist. Yeah. But I also think when you even think like the startup world, like generalist is a really powerful skill set. Yeah. Do you feel, or like, what do you think are the most maybe important skills as a generalist? Is it being like operator? Is it like?
I think the important skills. One, I think if I go back to problem solving, it's like you are able to zoom out, be a voice of reason, and look at how all the pieces come together. I think you're able to be the voice in the room that says, I hear you, but there's also this, and kind of make sense of a lot of things for people. I think there's a big communication and kind of empathy part to it as well, because you kind of go, when we specialize and we're in our functions, we see our point of view really strongly, and it's probably right, but there's another point of view, and there has to be something in between. And I think as a generalist, you can go, I completely get where you're coming from. Maybe I can adapt this for you. And I think there's just an element of getting to the end goal, that generalist that you do. I think there's also, like, if I'm honest, there's a real leadership potential in being a generalist, because if you look at any kind of leader role, it doesn't matter if you're the head of media specifically, you're not going to survive in that role unless you understand how all the other parts of the business come together and how your part fits into the rest. So I think regardless whether you want to lead in a specialization or you want to be a leader of, an MD or across a business, being a generalist is going to be absolutely fundamental, because you need to know how to work across the rest of the business, and you need to kind of know enough about the other functions to be able to add value also to the rest of the business as well.
And in terms of like adding value to the rest of the business, how do you then assess like KPIs as a generalist in what you do? What is it tied to?
It's hard. I think about the role that I'm in now, I'm probably seen as the most of the generalist, but the way I see KPIs in my role, I don't have specific quantitative KPIs. The business KPIs are my KPIs. So KPIs are then a little bit more qualitative in how you're facilitating the business getting done. Like, what are you unblocking for people? What are you monitoring for people? So the KPIs are softer, but also more challenging, because the business results are kind of owned by you. So if you say, oh, that marketing campaign didn't work because X KPI wasn't reached, you have to kind of reflect on yourself and say, did I unblock enough for them? Was I able to get the resources that they need? Did I make sure the capabilities were there? Was that marketing approach following the right business strategy? So ultimately, I think the KPIs are a little bit, they're broader, they're kind of business KPIs.
And what does your team look like then? So strategy and operations at Spotify. Yeah. So what's your team structure? Who's in your team? What are you responsible for?
So I think, like, in terms of how the role comes together at Spotify, I'm going to give you a really kind of crappy analogy, so bear with me. I was thinking about this today. It's kind of like you're taking your friends on a road trip and you need to put in the destination. So you need to set the navigation, and then you need to make sure that your vehicle or your car can actually get there. So that's kind of what the strategy and operations role is. It's like setting the strategy in collaboration with everyone, but you're kind of the center point to make sure that, okay, I hear all the views and now we're going to get that strategy in place. And then you're kind of making sure that engine works. Do we have enough petrol? Is there oil? You know what I mean? So you're facilitating that being done. But kind of day to day in the role, you can get pulled in a lot of different directions. So there's a few things that I try to kind of anchor like my role in that help me, I guess, understand where the value is and also position me, and so people know what they can come to me for. So there's three things. There's a strategy part that I mentioned, but then the strategy happens like once a year. You set the strategy and then you have to actually execute the strategy. And there's two other things there. There's, which my boss actually, we were talking about this week, and I think it's kind of an elegant way of summing it up. It's the compliance function, which sounds harsh, but I'll explain it. And then there's a kind of an enabling function. So compliance is like, okay, are we tracking against the strategy? We set this in place. Are we actually moving in that direction? And then the reporting and everything that comes with that. And then the enabling is, are we setting our teams up for success? Do they have the right resources? Do they have the right structure? Do we have the right product? So that's kind of how the role comes together in those three things. In terms of team structure, there's a few parts to it. So I think my team structure involves role adjacencies. So roles that feed into mine that help me do what I do. So in strategy and ops, you have teams like the analytics team that feed into you, the insights team that feed into you, the product team that feed into you. And so that's kind of, we're all kind of on the same line, supporting kind of the business, I guess, information and insights function. And then in my team specifically, it really depends, like throughout Spotify this differs, but in my team specifically, we look at more market experts. So our team structure includes other market strategy teams that are specific for markets, because that market has a bit of a layer of complexity to it and we need a market expert there. And then there's kind of more the support ones. How do we keep the operation flowing in terms of operational rhythms and things like this?
Interesting. So I guess like when we think about strategy and operations as well, like it's so different business to business, and like what does it mean? And I think like when we think about operations as well, like this is something I've really learned the value of, is I think it's sometimes I think we live in this world where everything has to have strict KPIs and, you know, what metric are you moving specifically? But I think there's a lot to be said for people that push the business forward and move the business forward, and I think it's actually quite like a generalist and ops, the ops is quite underrated as well. Is it something that you've had to educate and lobby for, or do you feel like it's widely understood the value it brings?
I think it's a good question. I think it depends on the organization. I think this role specifically in Spotify is such an established role, and it was kind of one of the first roles to come into market. So there is an understanding that this exists. I think some challenge comes with the KPIs, and I think that's more, okay, I think that's not coming from the team, it's coming from yourself. You think about, what am I actually, at the end of the year, what did I say I accomplished? Do you know what I mean? So you don't have, I launched that campaign or I did that product launch. So that's a little bit tricky. So, and you know, if I see my colleagues putting posts on LinkedIn, I was like, I don't own one thing. Like I can't post about that. Like I don't know what to do. So I think it's more about zooming out, and I think that's just part of it. You accept that the team success is your success, and that's kind of how I view it as well. Like if someone is able to execute their job in a really efficient way, in a way that is, you know, matching goals, then I think I've done my job properly, because I've been able to kind of facilitate that happening.
And in terms of then like facilitating the whole like strategy, how you build strategy, what's your framework, how often do you meet, how do you instill that, you kind of stay, like you say, you stay on the sat nav and you're staying in your directions, how do you talk me through how you build that? Okay,
you're coming at a good time, because we just came out of our strategy process. We do this kind of big kind of strategy process in markets once a year. But I have some kind of like toolkits that we use that kind of help standardize it. I think the first one, and it comes from a book that was recommended to me, there's a book called Playing to Win. And basically it's a long book, but the premise of it is you need to know where to play and how to play. And so where to play, and this is kind of a broad organizing concept. If you think about where to play, that can cover geographic, demographic, or like product categories. So it's also about making trade-offs. It's like we play here, not here. And then you get into the idea of how to play, and that becomes more specifically what are your levers? Kind of what are the things you're going to do in each of these areas that you've discovered is where to do. So is it like, you can literally think of it as a matrix. It's like we have all these levers available to us, whether it's marketing, comms, business development, partnership. Which one of these are we going to activate in the where that we've chosen? And that's kind of the organizing concept. And then once you have the how to play, you can filter that down into, okay, what's the resources needed or capabilities needed to actually make those levers work? And that's kind of the big picture thinking. But another one that I found really, really helpful, and it's a marketing concept, so you're probably aware of it, it's the jobs to be done concept. So we've been using this for a few years at Spotify, and why I think, well, in our local teams anyway, and what it's been really good at is that we have very cross-functional teams. We have like music teams, marketing teams, growth, comms, everywhere, but we use the jobs to be done as a kind of a market theme. So it's not about my job to be done as a marketeer is to do X. This is the job to be done for the market. And then how does everyone else feed into that? If this is the job to be done, I need to get the consumer from here to here. Then how is every single person or every single function feeding into that? And we found that because the first one I explained to you, which is the where to play and how to play, tends to be quite high level. And that's kind of what we do, I suppose, with my kind of my leads and my MD is figure that out. But the jobs to be done is more of a how you then communicate that on to your team. And so I found that kind of that leveling of that framework to be really helpful.
And in terms of then how long is your team spending on building the strategy for next year? The pre-planning, the data collection, the industry insights. Like how long does that?
I'd say honestly, it's all year, because the data and insights are coming all year. I think that's kind of my job we don't start, in say September, and then, we have to have it by December. It doesn't really work that way. In September, the physical deliverables start to roll in, but we are collecting data and understanding the market and kind of assessing things we do on an ongoing basis. And then these things will all feed into the strategy at the end of the year. So I would say practically, strategy, the heavy lift of it probably takes about 2 months to the end of the year, but that isn't such a heavy lift if you've kind of benefits been on your mind the entire year. We kind of start with, this is our objectives, this is our jobs to be done for the market, but we're tracking that constantly, because also within the year, you can't be tied to one thing. If you're finding it's not working, then you've got like a real-time feedback loop here, and we start to make changes. But I'd say that, and that's probably one of the points of the role that I have as well, is that's not, you're not waiting to the end of the year to figure out if your strategy worked. You know what I mean? You're monitoring it the entire time. But I would say that I think this end of year gets a lot easier if you've been doing your job properly throughout the year.
Yeah. And how do you I think a lot of people get this wrong, and a lot of founders get this wrong, and business operators is they sometimes say, this is what we're going to do. And when do you cut your losses sometimes? When do you say this isn't working? I think that's a hard skill. It's a hard skill, right?
That's hard. That's also really hard because you also want to encourage a culture of innovation. So I think that there's a few different ways to look at this. It depends on the stakes, what the resources allocated to this thing that isn't working. I think you want to encourage a culture of innovation, and you want people to keep iterating on things, but at some point, you also can't be irresponsible when something's not working. So I would say that there's probably kind of a resource. It's kind of defined by the resources. You can try something once, and it has a lot of resources attached to it, but if this doesn't work or have any indication of working, then you have to be responsible. You have to be, and then the smaller things, then you can scale it back. Maybe scale back the idea, okay, this didn't work, but I think I could test this. So we have quite a good culture of testing in Spotify, smaller things. We do a lot of this, which is really good. I think on the bigger pieces is when it gets tricky. It's like, when do you cut your losses? And we really think about this as how important is this thing working in the grand scheme of Spotify's kind of strategy and our local market strategy. But it's honestly, it's not. It's a case by case, and it's a really hard one to I think to figure out. But being data informed is obviously the best way to kind of deal with that.
And thinking, when you said their local market strategy, one thing I think Spotify do really well is the localization.
Yeah.
Like, I've always just felt Spotify is so different to me in the UAE than it is for me in the UK.
Yeah.
And I can't actually, thinking about it now, I can't put my finger on why or where or how it feels different, but it feels different to me. Like, how much freedom do you get with Spotify in this market to be able to localize product initiatives? Or
I think there's a few. Localization is key, and thank you for saying that. I'll tell the editors, because a lot of the localization that's done is on the content that you see, because there's localization on the marketing side, but when you open the app, that's going to be localized for the kind of the market you're in and the content you consume. I think we think about localization in a few ways. There's kind of the localization that is just foundational. Okay, you're kind of in a market, your marketing comms have to be a certain language. You have to respect cultural nuances. You can't put the same ad or copy in Dubai as you're going to put in Saudi. And then just regulation. So there's kind of the localization of doing business. And then there's a localization that kind of really drives the business forward as well. And this is where our value add is. So the localization that drives the business, I think one of the key pillars is the marketing and communications approach. And a big part of that is kind of how we tap into fandoms and communities. Spotify is a culture brand. And I think my experience, whether it was in luxury or retail or before, was these are culture brands. So fandoms are really important. So how we localize for different communities and how our comms are shaped for different communities. For example, for gamers in Saudi, for entertainment in UAE, or in Pakistan, which we cover for cricket or for food. And then the product localization is a really big one. So product localization, there's the content itself. This is localized by our editors. So while we're all Arab-speaking countries, the content consumed in the UAE looks much more like kind of South Asian or Western, you know, and a small skew of Arabic. So then the content in Saudi looks probably majority Arabic. Even the language choice in the app itself, you'll find people that are listening to Spotify mostly in English. Or the platform language is mostly in English in UAE. It's mostly in Arabic in Saudi. So how we localize the product really matters as well. And then the other part is like the localization through teams. So the teams that actually execute, so the market experts that come and actually inform the content choices that we're making, inform kind of the community and the fandom kind of outreach that we're doing as well.
And I love what you touched on there. UAE is so different to Saudi.
Yeah.
I think this is, anybody who's based in the UAE will know this. And I think there's always those, you know, when you think about it from, you know, headquarters coming from Europe or coming from the US, and they look into this market, there's quite a assumption that people treat MENA the same, and especially like the GCC. So how do you like, do you feel there's that?
Look, I think there definitely is that, and I think it's, any of us have worked for international brands, it doesn't matter what it is, that's the challenge that we face. We always have to advocate to say no, they're not the same. I think, but from a starting point is that if you look at our markets, particularly GCC, or zoom out from MENA, there are a lot of similarities. So you understand, like, you know, for a GCC, for example, look at the macros are the same. All of the GCC markets are going through some sort of transformation on their own right. There's even, you know, pan-Arab media that crosses over. So you zoom out and someone's looking at that, then you can see why they think, we can treat this as one market. We'll just, you know, there's a lot of efficiency in that. And I think that strategy can work to a point, you know what I mean? You can kind of skim the top of a lot of these markets with that strategy. But the problem is once you go deeper, that stops to work. And I think one of the things that happens there is that you don't even, it's like building the understanding of each of the markets. If you look at the GCC, it's not even different between kind of, one of the things is that you've got expat communities of 50% to 80% in all of these markets. And then those expat communities look different in each market. So this is like adds another layer of complication. So I think it's a real challenge to kind of convince people that, okay, yes, there's efficiency in skimming the top, but you, after a certain level, you absolutely have to go deeper. And I think that becomes really important when it's culture brands as well. Culture brands like, you know, whether it's fashion or whether it's Spotify now, you have to be able to tap into the culture of each market as well.
Yeah. And how do you like tap in, right? So I always think of Uber and Lyft in the US, right? So Uber was hyper localized per city. They hired directly in cities, in like had feet on the ground, boots on the ground. Lyft was very different. So how do you approach that localization to make sure that you're like, do you have someone who knows the business really well coming over internationally and starting up shop, or do you focus more on building out the local teams and kind of grassroots up?
I think our strategy is kind of grassroots up. So that's the point of the local teams. I think there's kind of a balance though between centralization and decentralization. It would be great if in all of the markets that we cover, we could have dedicated teams, but that's just not the environment that we operate in. So I think what we've really tried to do is like, what's the right balance of what can be centralized and what is really important on the ground. And it does also go back to thinking about like the how to play part. If you have markets that are key markets for you and they're marketing driven, then you absolutely, or music driven, then you absolutely have to have boots on the ground, because they need to inform kind of your fandom strategy, your local content strategy. If you have other markets that could potentially be serviced through a partnership deal, you know, a BD deal, that becomes something that can be centralized. I think what's good about MENA is that although they're vastly different, all of the markets, there is some sort of pan-Arab connector. So what we've done and what we've tried to do is build kind of a central strategic hub where we think that where things really need to be centralized, where it comes to product uniformity, or marketing kind of toolkits, that stuff is kind of centralized. But then when the markets have to have a really strong cultural element, we start to build out local teams. So it's kind of that constant balance, and it's really informed by what we're trying to extract in terms of the consumer opportunity from that market as well.
And what does that team look like? So if you were to go into a new market today, what skill set would you hire for first, or be your first maybe 3 hires?
Honestly, it depends. It depends on the market. And I think it goes back to what we were saying, how we build our team structures. I think about it as like structure follows strategy. So when you look about, okay, we're playing in these markets. Okay, this is the decision we've made. How we play in these is very different. So we've decided that this market A, is just about partnerships. Okay, then that means the hires for that market are going to look very different to another market where we've said this is our key marketing market. We need to build our brand here because there's a lot of brand spillover, there's a lot of culture. So that team looks completely different. Markets that have a lot of complexity, I think first it would be maybe less an executional role and then a strategy role. But I think how we build our teams is basically informed by the specific strategy that we've addressed. So yeah, I think the important thing there is that structure follows the strategy of the market.
And how do you keep because one of the things as well, right, is the more you become international, and this is something I always think about, is the more international satellite offices you have, the more you're expanding. How do you keep the alignment? Because why is it that I can more, it's simple, right? Walk into an Apple store in one city versus another, it's Apple, I know it, right? They're the best brands in the world that feel the same. Amazon feels really local here, but it still feels the same Amazon I know back home. So how do you keep that consistency for not just consumers from a brand standpoint, but just from like a business continuity?
I think that's a really good question. So alignment has like a few different buckets to it. We don't really think about alignment from like marketing. There's marketing alignment, there's product alignment, and then there's team alignment. I think when you think about marketing and product alignment, that's where centralization is really important. Localization is important, but kind of you centralize those core assets. So for marketing, that looks like, the brand identity, basically the tone of voice and things like this, the things we do and don't say. For product, that is the core product experience has to look the same. The shell is looking the same across all the markets. So things like marketing and product probably have a much heavier skew to being centralized than decentralized, and that's how the alignment is kept. And I think the other important point is the team alignment. So how do you have, we have 23 markets that we cover at the moment. We don't have teams for all of them, but we have teams working across a really big section of markets. So keeping the alignment with the team is really important. And something that we do a lot of is trying to markets have their own individual goals, but as a region we have goals. And I think it's just about building. When we build strategy out, we start from a regional lens. We don't start from a market lens. So what is our region about? What is the value we're adding to the business? And what are we all working towards? So having kind of a regional North Star and then filtering that into kind of market level plans. So that's one. But then alignment, I think it's an ongoing process. So one of the things that's part of my role as well is this, what we call the rhythm in Spotify, so our operating rhythm. How are we bringing the teams together? What are the forums that are really important, and what's the cadence of those? And these include things like, activity updates, what's actually happening across the region, and then retros, how did we actually do? And then frequently in that, like the execution team will come together. So I think it's about making sure that as you kind of separate and have market experts working on things, that you're coming back together for those key moments, for like the North Star moments as well.
And when you want to then go into new markets, like how do you make that decision? What informs your biggest decision for like market entry?
So I think it's about, is the market ready and are we ready? So our kind of market expansion will ultimately be informed by the bigger business goals. Are we trying to grow, and is there an opportunity there that we need to tap into that makes sense for the business? When we think about going into new markets, we do kind of pretty exhaustive study, and it's, what's the size of the consumer opportunity and what's the operational complexity to actually get that consumer opportunity. One thing we also look at is future audiences, because one thing you can do is you can kind of follow a trend. Oh, this market is, everyone's about this market right now, but what's actually the audience now, and will there be a future audience for your product? Also, what's the competitive landscape? How are we equipped? And then we think about also how ready are we to actually take that opportunity, because going into a new market requires capabilities and it requires a new skill set sometimes. So if we have a market that has very similar characteristics to another, then that's a much easier we have the team, we have the capability. So it's really assessing our capabilities to act. I think product market fit is a really big one there. So is the product we're selling actually appropriate for the market? Is there a level of customization that we can or can't do? Is there actually is there an audience for this?
And what is it then that you see most people getting wrong when they think about new markets or launching new markets or even trying to like localize into new markets? What is it what aren't they doing right?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think one, just understanding the consumer opportunity correctly, because you can't do everything and you can't make everyone happy. So you have to like fully understand who you're talking to and the size of that opportunity, because there's a lot of new shiny things right now in the GCC. There's a lot of things popping up and the world is really excited, but they are amazing opportunities, but is your product appropriate for that opportunity? Is the audience for your product big enough for that opportunity? So I think it's just actually taking a very kind of pragmatic view of the size of the opportunity and the readiness of that consumer or that market for what you're trying to sell. It could be an incredible market that's thriving and going through everything, but is that consumer actually ready for what you sell? And I think you maybe potentially move too quickly and try to capture something that that's trending at the time, but not actually think if that's the right move for you.
Interesting. So when we think about your experience, so started off in marketing, kind of coming to where you are now, I would love to get your thoughts on where you feel the marketing landscape is going. Love to hear about it at Spotify, but we're kind of entering this new world. Obviously, AI is coming in, data is readily available. Like, what do you think future of marketing looks like?
So I haven't been in marketing for a few years, so I'm a bit rusty on that. I think when we discussed earlier, it's the question now about traditional brand marketing and then or more performance driven marketing. Okay, and so that's a question that I think most businesses are tackling with now, and also now coming into tech, that's obviously the big question. I think my background in marketing has always been for kind of these bigger lifestyle luxury brands, so traditional marketing is kind of where I come from, and I'll always be biased towards that. It's also where it's fun and sexy, and you build these beautiful big campaigns. What I'm learning and what I'm seeing is that it's brand marketing and performance marketing don't work without each other. So I think about marketing now and how it's probably just too much of a pragmatic view of it. It's kind of like it's demand generation, which is brand marketing, and then it's demand capture. And you can't really there's no point spending and investing all of this time in generating demand if you have no kind of tool to capture it, especially in brands like Spotify. So I'm learning it's more about a balance of those things. And obviously, depending on where your market's at in terms of maturity, the skew of that will be very different. But I think ultimately where I'm seeing kind of performance marketing be really useful, because I would have never kind of seen that as a standalone tool. Where performance marketing has been really useful is we talked about skimming the top a little bit in some of the pan-Arab opportunities. When you have a lot of markets and you don't have maybe the resources to go deep in marketing, in the full suite of marketing, performance marketing does a really good job of just capturing any demand that exists. Yeah. Especially when you're looking at like brands with big international brand halos, it can get that kind of low-hanging fruit, so to speak. But I think where it's really optimal and where we've seen success is kind of how do you balance the demand generation and demand capture. And the skew for us, because I think different brand maturity is always more on the brand side, but brand side will always be a ton more effective if you have the right tool for kind of demand capture as well.
So when you enter new markets, when you look at like localized marketing budgets, do you have more of a preference towards the brand or the performance, and how does that change as the market develops?
Honestly, I think there is definitely more of a preference towards brands, because you have to create awareness and you have to create demand. So there will always be, especially for our markets, the skew will be much higher to kind of building that awareness and building that demand. And then performance marketing can kick in. But I think the important thing to kind of know is, even in new markets, is that you can't have everything invested in brand without anything to capture it. So it is a balance, but I think the ratios will much heavier skew to brand in early stages. And then as that's kind of been built and that demand's been built and it's kind of, self-fulfilling, then you can probably skew more on the other side. I think not the only, but one thing where performance marketing is useful is when you have this kind of long tail of markets that you can't get to all of them. Okay, so performance marketing is kind of a good tool to just be present and capture what you can, but it's not a tool for kind of market expansion.
Yeah. And do you feel like there's a more of a, because I think we entered this world where everything was so performance heavy, like you were saying, right? It was so every dollar could be measured.
Yeah.
And I think like as marketeers and even business owners, I think lost our way a little bit by thinking that measure everything.
Yeah.
And I actually think maybe now we're in a space where people want brand, people want, how do you stand out? Like, is it creative taste? Like, is that why you think you're becoming more on the brand side again?
The thing is, I would say that we do measure everything. We absolutely measure everything. But I think where the measurement makes sense is that we're always kind of we measure brand and we measure business, and we try to put those two things together. I think where I've seen probably Spotify is the best example in my experience of measuring brand is that we've always been able to do that. We measure every aspect of the brand funnel, but then we also are able to associate it back to business impact. So for example, we could have a campaign where the brand metrics go off the chart in terms of awareness, and that also moves the business. And then we can put those things together and say, we don't measure it dollar for dollar, but we'll be able to say, look, driving brand grows the business. And then you'll have other scenarios where you'll have like your brand metrics will go off the chart from something, but you actually wouldn't have grown at all. The business wouldn't have moved. And then you can start to think about, okay, maybe it wasn't awareness that we were chasing in this case. Maybe it's there. Maybe we need to look at consideration. So I think there is value in measuring. I think like I know that I find it difficult now because I was a marketeer, so it felt like you, but now I'm on the business side. So now it's my job to justify our expenses and say, okay, if we're spending that, what are we getting? So I think there's kind of a middle ground to be. I do agree with you that we can go too far, that we can say, oh no, every dollar has to be accounted for. And there is this thing we call organic growth. And organic growth doesn't happen on its own. Organic growth is the result of a lot of brand effort and a lot of kind of top of mind awareness from people. And I don't think that can ever be ignored. So brand has a lot of power that often can't be measured. But where it can be measured, it can also be kind of a really good tool for what part of the brand are we working on now?
And you mentioned there, how do you measure awareness? Or how are you measuring awareness?
Consumer surveys. I mean, I think we have, there's a lot of different tools, but most of it is on consumer facing and just like regular cadence of doing large sample sizes of that.
How do you think maybe like smaller businesses can measure awareness when you can't afford to do surveys? And
honestly, I think social media sentiment checks is like a great way of doing that. Google Trends, measuring that, like you can stack up Google Trends and Google conversations with competitors. But I think ultimately, even us, we have quite a rigorous kind of marketing measurement system, which is big focus groups. But really, what we really look at is the social media comments and the sentiment. If we really we have to take all the results with a grain of salt because you have 500 sample set, but that maybe isn't reflective of the market. So when we really want to go, okay, what's happening here? We go to social media and we measure the chatter, we measure the sentiment, we look at competitors. So I think there's a lot of ways you can measure it. I think you also don't have to have such like organized and rigorous ways of engaging with consumers. It's easy to chat to people. You know what I mean? It's like that's also a big part of what we do and what our job is. So while we have all these incredible tools, there's often a lot more value in saying, by the way, I spoke to a bunch of people and they had no idea that we did that. And I told them. So it's kind of, I think there's a lot of ways. Yeah, definitely.
And how do you, because I think it's really difficult when it comes to like marketing and marketeers and creatives.
Yeah.
I think it's really difficult to instill into them sometimes the performance aspect. So how do you make sure they're also bought into the performance and not just ideation of concepts?
Honestly, we have business KPIs for most of the work that we do, and it's something that is more recent, I would say. It's more of a recent shift. It's that when we set objectives for different things, for a marketing campaign, for example, a social media campaign, where it used to be, okay, I'm going to move awareness by X. Now it's okay, actually, are you going to move this business metric by an amount? So it's just, and it's not easy, you know what I mean? There is the inertia in terms of how we measure marketing and the soft and that kind of qualitative feedback loop. But we've just moved to a part where we are very performance driven. And it doesn't mean we're not doing brand marketing at all. It means we're just being really intentional about brand marketing.
You've mentioned fandom a few times.
Yeah.
What is fandom at Spotify?
it's basically a community around a particular passion point. And it's like a really, really strong passion point that kind of brings people together. So we think about fandom as like kind of a force of like a driving force in terms of culture and the culture at local makeup of a market. So, you know, look at football. Football is one that spans the entire kind of MENA region. Is probably the one connector of the MENA region is football. And that's such a key fandom because people come together, they're engaged in it. They're so passionate about it. So that's what we think about fandom. It's like, if this is where communities are gathering, and this is where their attention is, and this is where they're at their, you know, this is what excites them, then what is there a role for us within this fandom? That makes sense, that's relevant. Not all fandoms will be relevant for us or our brand, but what we try to find is fandoms are ultimately groups of audience, okay? And they're passionate about something, so how can we be relevant in that fandom? I think as you get deeper, it would be really fun to just like, you know, experiment in tiny little niche fandoms of tiny groups of people, and that's ultimately where we'd like to go. But at the moment we're looking at, okay, what if Spotify's a new to this part of the world, relatively speaking, but there are things that are really established and strong that people gather around. And if we can find a relevant role in this, or we can enhance that fandom experience, for example, thinking about gaming, you listen to music in the background of gaming, like that's Spotify's role in that. So we think about how do we make that experience better for them, and how can we be part of that fandom? You know, how can we, it's kind of being where your customers are, ultimately. We can shout down on them from our media, or we can be literally on their journey.
And how do you make sure that customer feedback loop goes to kind of everyone throughout the organization? What does that look like at Spotify? How do you keep that as like a regular feedback channel?
We have quite kind of rigorous tools for tracking customer sentiment. We do, like I said, we have regular brand monitoring, which is more focus group led, which is kind of quite macro, which gives us a good snapshot in time of brand health, and we really rely on social media. We really rely on the sentiment checks and comments and things like this. This is quite rigorous. These are reports that are shared, you know, weekly and sometimes. So we do really use those.
Amazing. Awesome. So we've got a closing kind of thing that I've been doing on this podcast, which is called Pass the Toolkit.
Okay.
And what I would like to know is what maybe podcast, book or resource or framework or something that you would give to anybody else who is maybe in the strategy and operations space in whether it's startup, scale up, corporate. What would you give to them if you were to pass something on?
Well, we started our conversation on being a generalist. There's actually a really good book on this, which kind of explains why being a generalist can be such an asset. It's called Range, and the author is David Epstein. So I think that book really shows you, kind of solidifies, okay, actually, I don't know. It's not that I don't know enough about these things. It's actually I know a lot more about a lot more things. And so it really shows the value of being a generalist, especially as the world gets a little bit more complicated. So I think it's quite validating as well. So that's a really good book. Podcasts, honestly, I listen to more kind of fiction podcasts at the moment, but I use podcasts as a way to disconnect from work. But there's one podcaster that I really like, Adam Grant. I know he's quite mainstream, but I find his advice kind of quite easy to digest and kind of actionable in some case. So I think his Work Life podcast is really good.
I know, I love Adam Grant, and that book has been in my bookcase. I actually think it's been there for probably about 6 years.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You're too busy starting a podcast to read
it. I'm a reader, but that book has been there, so I'll have to pick it up. Ruthie, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. We've been through so much, from strategy, operations, marketing, building regional teams. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And to anybody listening, please follow, like, and subscribe, and join us next time for an episode of She Builds.